I'm also the Associate Dean for Faculty in the medical school. I've been in that position for 2 years, and we've had our Center for Women's Health since 2003. And we're very happy to present today Jerica Berge, who's going to be our lecturer for the day. She's an assistant professor and researcher in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health here at the university. She's actually going up for promotion this year, so if I was introducing her next year, I'm sure I'd be saying she's an associate professor. We have a really prestigious Department of Family Medicine nationally. The University of Minnesota's department is ranked 3rd in the nation for funding for family practice departments, with more than $5 million in NIH funding. Family medicine is generally not as focused on research as like the Department of Medicine or some of the other departments in the medical school, but our family medicine department is really known for their research. And this year, Dr. Berge was told that she is in the top 30 as far as funded researchers across the country in family medicine. So she obviously plays a large role in the status of our Department of Family Medicine. Her research interest is in examining the risk and protective factors for childhood and adolescent obesity in the home environment. And she has conducted childhood obesity prevention intervention studies and observational studies, and uses mixed methods, including direct observational methods, community-based participatory research, and survey research. She has had several NIH grants, including being funded by our Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health Training Grant that is operated through the Powell Center for Women's Health. So we clearly did a good job when we chose her to be on our grant, given that our grants are judged by how successful our scholars are when they leave the grant. She's going to be talking today about what is being served for dinner, the association between family dynamics at family meals and child health outcomes. So join me in welcoming Dr. Berge.
All right, so it's nice to look out and see other researchers that I know do childhood obesity prevention research, as well as specifically around family meals. So it's great to have others in the room that are experts in this area, and several Berge scholars. So I have to, again, shout out from the Berge that I think that was one of the pivotal things in my training that allowed me to start to bridge some of my background. My doctorate degree was in family studies and the clinical emphasis in family therapy. And then as I was able to get this Berge Award, which is the K-12 award, I was able to go back and do my MPH, which allowed me to really bridge the fields of mental health, family functioning, and interactions with what's going on in public health, and how to really move the field forward in understanding the family, how it relates to public health. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this is from a grant in R21 that was actually, the pilot was done during my Berge time. I was able to get pilot data and funded this R21. So what I'd like to do is start a little bit talking about family meals in general. I'm sure you have your own recollection of these, so for a moment I actually want you to do a little traveling back in time. For some of you that could be this morning or yesterday. For others this could be 10, 15 years ago. So think of the family that you grew up with, and think about in general recollections of family meals. So think about who was there, so visually who would be at those meals. Is it parents, is it siblings, is it grandparents, is it neighbors? Who might be those people that would have been at your family meals? What do you remember even as far as like smells? Is there a certain smell that you remember that you knew a family meal was being cooked, or you were going to have a family meal? What are those types of sensory things that you remember about it? And in general, how did you feel about those family meals? Did you, if you think back now, is it just a general positive experience, and you think about, my family meals were actually quite positive. I liked them, they were enjoyable. I talked a lot with my family. I grew closer to them during that time. Were they just really kind of average or neutral? We really needed to just kind of feed ourselves, and that was the goal. Or there are obviously some that were negative, and people avoided family meals for some reasons as well. And so I think the spectrum of your experience is useful to think about when I talk about this study. So now I want you to fast forward a little bit to just now, and I want you to think about whether you're in your own family unit, if you're in a couple, if you are living with roommates, if you're living alone. What do your meals look like now? Have you carried forward? Have you carried forward any family meals or shared meals with people that you currently live with? And even if you live on your own, do you seek out opportunities for shared meals or meals with other people? And think a little bit about why that might be, and if that's your experience. So with that backdrop, I want to just talk a little bit about family meals in general. One of the things that's interesting and unique about a family meal is that it's a pretty concrete, specific thing that goes on in a family and in a culture. So we talk about it in the family studies field as a ritual, which is just also known as a routine. So the kind of rules that have something to fall into a categorization of a routine is that it has to be a pattern that regularly occurs and that has some set of rules, whether they're spoken or unspoken. There's things that just happen at family meals that you know are going to happen. So maybe as you were thinking back about growing up, you might have thought about some of these rules already that, you know, we really sat around that table until everyone was done and no one left until you got permission. And that could have been a spoken rule or an unspoken rule, or you know, there was a look from a parent or a sibling that taught you something about whether you could take seconds or not, or maybe there was the rule that family meals was just a time where you talk and you communicate, so there's a lot of laughing and joking around, things like that. So that's what you mean when I say there's some sets of rules, whether they're spoken or unspoken. The other thing about family meals is that in the majority of cultures there's some form of family meals, whether it's a dinner or a breakfast or a lunch, there's some form of shared eating. And also, another kind of trademark of a ritual is that there's some kind of value placed on this across cultures. So at family meals, the same type of thing. Most cultures have some type of value around family meals, and some more than others. They're more deeply valued than others, but they exist in the majority of cultures, and there's some value around them. And the other thing about a ritual is that there's some type of family dynamics or interpersonal interactions that are occurring at these rituals or routines. So for family meals, you can imagine obviously there's communication that might be occurring. There might be modeling of behaviors. There's a chance for education. And of course that goes to extremes. It could be education and enlightening things versus on the spectrum of maybe lecturing and being negative. But all these things happen at family meals. And so because it's a ritual or routine, and it's kind of this idea you can wrap your mind around, it's been very recently in the public health field, but for quite a while in other fields, an area of interest because we think about family meals because it's a concrete time and there's rules kind of around it and things that we know occur, we think about it as a modifiable characteristic in the home. And that if you want to intervene on something, you want it to be a modifiable factor, something that you could actually do something about or change. And since it can potentially be intervened on, lots of different disciplines actually have looked at family meals. So I wanted to take a brief tour here of family meals and what has been done at this point in family meals and why it has become one of the most well-researched topics across several disciplines. So first of all, we know that family meals has been studied across children and teens, so all ages and developmental stages, across race and ethnicity, so really trying to get a picture, again, of how families operate and where they occur. And also it's across SES and gender, and then more recently in adults too, trying to figure out what effects family meals have on behavior. And when I say lots of research, this doesn't mean like in one specific field, so like public health can't claim that all these things have been well researched. In fact, that's what we're trying to do actually and learn more about them. But in other disciplines, we actually know quite a bit about family meals and how they operate. So I'm going to look through a few of these skills then, family social science being one of the first ones, and psychology, where we've learned actually quite a bit about family meals, and we know that family meals have played out over cross-sectional and longitudinal studies as being quite protective across quite a few of these factors. So first of all, in family social science, they've looked at how the frequency of family meals, so how often people have family meals together, association with all these listed factors. So children do well academically, how about future job success, those things that kind of matter in a parent's mind for kids' future, how it looks with communication, family connectedness, and importantly also to a lot of parents is high-risk behaviors, how kids turn out as far as high-risk behaviors, and emotional well-being and depression. So across, like I said, just cross-sectional as well as longitudinal research, all of these factors have been shown to be associated with the frequency of family meals. So the more that you have, the more likely your child is to have good academic success. And the research has actually shown this on standardized testing, actual hard concrete outcomes, as well as things like social abilities and friends and connecting with other kids. And I'm sure in your mind you can have some hypotheses around why this might be. As far as the other things here, like communication, family connectedness, again, kind of makes sense because there's a chance to model and see how to interact with people. And then the high-risk behaviors, there's some hypotheses around why that might be the case. And as you can imagine, first things is that there's kind of a sense of monitoring that happens at family meals. Even if it's not a true lecturing type of experience, there's some sense of security and safety that something's predictable and will happen often. And whether it's every day, once a week, this ritual or routine brings that sense of security or comfort to families and children that reduces this risk of drinking and drug smoking, risky sexual behavior. So in the family field, this is not necessarily a new area for them and has been emphasized for a long time in trying to get families to do more family meals. All right, moving on to the medical field. I guess a few decades ago, really, the medical world started obviously recognizing that families are important to kids' chronic conditions and management of chronic conditions. And many chronic conditions have food as a mechanism of managing, whether they have good outcomes or not so good outcomes with their illness. And so diabetes, research on diabetes has shown association, especially with young kids, with even better A1C levels. I mean, it's quite exciting when you can get results that are so specific. Also quality of food intake, so fruits and vegetables, types of foods kids eat. And then asthma. This connection may not seem as obvious to you, but in one study that was done on asthma control was a study where they compared children who had asthma who were overweight versus non-overweight, and they found that more chaotic family functioning at the family meal was associated with being more overweight. And so, as you know, being overweight causes exacerbations for asthma, so there's a connection there that has been explored, and again, has been one of the ways in which diabetes, especially at the point that I work at, we encourage family meals to help control some of this. All right, so then moving on to the field that I currently do research in, public health. So I believe, knowing this, that family meals has been shown to be associated with such great outcomes with kids across race, ethnicity, on these other factors, public health really wanted to look into this and see how this fits with childhood obesity prevention. So there has been research that's already shown that health and dietary intake is an outcome that as you have more frequent family meals, you have better dietary intake. So family meals have been shown to be protective in that realm. And then disordered eating as well. And a lot of these studies have been done actually here at the University of Minnesota with a study called Project EAT, and it's been going on for years, and it's cross-sectional and longitudinal, 15-year longitudinal data showing these associations. So there's really strong evidence that the frequency of family meals matters. The more you have, the kids are protected. Now, childhood overweight status, there's been mixed results. Some studies showing that it is protective against overweight, and some showing that it's not. Some showing at cross-sectionally that it is, and longitudinally it's not. Some suggesting different genders are more protected as well as ethnicities. So there's a lot still to be done. And so where we are currently is that a lot of the studies that have been done have shown that, in fact, there is this really strong association with the quantity or the amount of family meals that one has and these protective factors in adolescence. And a lot of the studies have kind of settled on a number about 5. Now, again, like I said, this is something where the bird is still out, I think, but several studies have kind of settled on this number to be most protective. So what has brought this up as I move forward in figuring out how I wanted to make my mark in the world here of childhood obesity prevention is I wanted to bring some of my background from family social science and look at some of these unknown pieces. So we really already know the what, that family meals matter, right? We know that's true. But the why, we don't know so much about. And so that was some of the impetus for the work that I took on to really look at the quality of the family meals, and this specifically around the family dynamics. Clearly there's a need to look also at the food, the quality of the food served at the meals. But this specific study started out by looking at family dynamics and interpersonal relations at the family meal. So this, as I said, we don't know so much about this, and why this I think would be useful is that if we have a better idea a little bit about what's happening and why in our minds we might have these hypotheses, but if we can show things that happen at the meal, especially if we can show them in children who are non-overweight versus overweight, and we can see that certain factors that happen at family meals are helpful for children so they can be protected from family meals, and maybe if we do find it stratified by weight status, that they're protected for children who are not overweight. We can teach those types of behaviors to parents who are struggling with the challenge of having an overweight kid. So that's kind of going into it, how this all came to be, and how putting things together, the real big thrust was to look at interpersonal relationships around the family meal. So what was born then of this is called Family Meals Live, and it's a mixed method study. I do a lot of research since I kind of straddle both fields that really values an in-depth look, so qualitative look at what happens around some phenomena, as well as quantitative look, so you can get more of the breadth or the more kind of power. You have the power to actually say something. So being able to mix these two methods has been really useful in what I've looked at. So this is a cross-sectional study in which we use direct observational methodology. And I'll talk just a second in a little bit about what that looks like. And what we really propose to do is to go into homes and do an observation period where we can video record family meals and really learn about, in a modern day look, what does family meals look like. So we've learned not only just about who's at the meal, these logistics, and how long they are, and that type of thing, but we can also look at behaviors that occur at the family meals, and some specific to food too. So in these observations, I'll tell you a little bit more about them, but we did video recorded family meals using iPads so that we could get a look at specific family meals over a week. We could get weekday, weekend. We also did a home food inventory to give us a better look at what was in the home. We did interviews with parents so we can learn a little bit more about what they thought about family meals, ideas about things they thought were important at family meals, barriers to family meals, and then other kinds of questions that help us understand their own personal experiences with family meals across different races and ethnicities. And then we also did a survey so we could get a lot of other kind of data to help us with understanding this picture of the home environment better. So I want to take a second to talk about direct observational research, because this comes up a lot. This is one of the things that, when I was putting this grant, I knew would be a red flag. Like, how do you ensure that people won't change their behavior, right? These are like big questions I get asked. So first things first, it's important to point out that in the fields of family science and psych and child development that these are decades old. They've used these kinds of methods for quite a while. You can kind of think about a lot of what we know about attachment was based on observational research in this strange situation, right? These types of things have come from these fields, and we already know about them. But taking them and learning from them so we can do as good quality observational research is important. So having had training in that in direct observational research and coding and how to do it, it made sense. It seemed to parallel quite well what we want to do in this study. So the key components that have been learned from direct observational research in other fields is the importance of having what's called a sensitization period. And that's the idea is people need to acclimate or get used to the equipment. So if you can imagine if there's video cameras in your house or an iPad or something in your house that you're not used to having, that you need to give them time to acclimate to it. Luckily, in the world that we live in now, we live in like reality TV world, so it's even less of an issue than it had been in the past, but you still kind of adhere to these acclimation time periods. And what that can look like is if you do a video of maybe a parent-child interaction, you could cut out the first 15 minutes, or you randomly code 10 minutes that are in a certain segment of the recording. If you have several observations, it's common to cut out the very first day of observations. So there's different ways to approach the sensitization period, but it's one of those things that you have to have. Obviously, multiple days of observation are best, so you can have more of a chance for the person to acclimate. And then the natural environment, a lot of the research that has been done in the lab, so a lot of the research earlier had been lab-based. As they compare across the natural environment, behaviors were more valid when they were actually measured in a natural environment like the home. So based on these recommendations, this is what came forward in the creation of this study. So I want to tell you as I move forward a little bit about how we went about sampling and the thought process behind who we sampled and why. So in this sample we have participants, which are 120 families, and again, because we're doing these mixed methods, we wanted to get enough so we feel like we could understand what was going on in the homes, but of course you can't have too much because it's impossible to do such in-depth types of mixed methods with too many people. So 120 families were recruited. These are families from low-income and minority households in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And as Dr. Raymond mentioned earlier, I work in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. And so we have primary care practices around the cities that and a research network where we can recruit through those networks in order to get participants. And for me, a key thing was to really understand more our low-income and minority populations, because this is where we see a lot of disparities in the childhood obesity literature, that in general, obesity is high prevalence across all races and ethnicities, but we know there's disparities, particularly among African American families and low-income families. And our clinics have a lot of those populations, so it worked well to use our clinics. So then another key thing we did was we stratified by weight status and then by age. We really wanted to get a chance to see if there's differences between these homes where there's non-overweight versus overweight kids, and how we can learn the things that are useful to help families so that more people can benefit from the protective effect of family meals. The other thing that we did, so I guess you can see it here how the race and ethnicity breaks down. So we had almost 80% were African American population, and then white and Hmong, Latino, and some mixed, fewer and fewer of those. And then we had a parent age range between 25 to 65, which shows that there's some grandparents and other caregivers in here. And then our age range was between the 6 to 12, and we also again had stratified from 6 to 8, 9 to 12, so we could see developmental differences as well. We also had 32% two-parent homes, 68 single-parent homes, and the majority of households were under the 25,000 SES income. So you can see, I mean, what we aimed for, luckily, we were able to achieve, and which is great, so we can really feel like we can learn what we were hoping to learn. So next, I want to tell you a little bit about what happened in these in-home observations. So we had, like I said earlier, we had 8-day family meal observations where they were video recorded. And we had a desensitization period, which is we just cut out the first day, given a chance for acclimation. They recorded the videos themselves in a natural environment in their home. So how that works is we really set up the iPads. They're already quite simple to use, but did a little training. We went in to teach them how to do this, set it up so they know how to do this. And then they had a little protocol that was left with them to be able to do this every night. And these families, just to say one other thing, the way they were eligible for the studies, they had to at least say they had 3 family meals a week in order for us to be able to actually see family meals happening. And people that had more frequent family meals, because if we want to learn about family meals, we want to study people who actually have them. So that was the setup, and I said the other things that we did also happened between the first and the second home visit, such as the interviews and the home food inventories. And then we really told them we really want to see what a modern day family meal looks like. So just eat as you normally do, where you normally eat. So we allowed the iPads to be moved from room to room so people could really do what they would normally do. Of course, if they ate out, we didn't have to take them to the place that they ate out. But we also had this ability to flex. So if they had a day that they always eat out on Tuesday nights, for instance, we would extend the observational period so we could still get the 8 days. And that was not a problem for us. All right, so I mentioned that we did a coding system. I want to tell you just briefly about this coding system. This is a coding system, again, that's been well validated in the psychology of family studies field. And there's hundreds and hundreds of codes where they actually code behaviors of families when they are asked to do certain tasks. So the IFERS, it's called the Iowa Family Interaction Rating Scales, and they do a lot of communication tasks with families. So they go in the home and they give them a task like, we want you to plan a family vacation. It's really kind of general and open. Again, in the natural environment, really basic thing to do, and then let them talk about it and see what happens as far as communication in that family. And so there's things that you would code them regarding diet, so mother-son, mother-daughter, father-daughter, father-mother, and then the whole group, the family enjoyment. So it really gives you a chance to look at different pairs of people in the family. There's things you can code about individual behavior, but you really get a sense of the family unit and relationships within the family unit when you use this coding system. So it's also a macro coding system, so not micro where you go in and count every single observance of a certain behavior. It gives you more of that global or gestalt look of the nature of behavioral exchanges between people. So it's really kind of, again, what we were looking for. So these are just examples of codes. So for instance, we would code hostility between different people, so the parent and the daughter, or the husband and the wife, or the grandma and the daughter, things like that. And then what we did is we created these food-related scales. So we took what normally happens, just that you'd code around just the emotional atmosphere, how people talk to each other and engage. Then we also adapted some scales to talk specifically around food. So for instance, the food hostility would be coded in things like, I'm not going to eat this gross food, or you're such a pig when you eat like that. Things like that would be, they're food related, but they're very hostile comments, right? Another one, parental influence might be something like, stay at the table until you're done eating. So it's like this kind of setting limit on kids' behaviors. Another example, food intrusiveness would be things like, you've got to clean your plate, or you shouldn't eat so much, things like that. Those are the kinds of things that got coded that were specific to the food environment. So as you can see, we could look at just general emotional atmosphere and then food-related specific atmosphere. So the students that were trained on the system, it took about actually 6 months for them to get to a place where they were really reliable. And it's pretty common on this coding system to do about 4 to 6 months training. And then at that point, you also still have a 5-to-1 ratio of reliability checking going on, just to make sure that you maintain that reliability. So you can see it's a lot of work, but once people are trained in this, you can typically, again, use this going forward. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about what we found. So answering the question, what does a modern-day family meal look like? We have some logistics around what were families doing. So we found that family meals occurred in several rooms in the house. Most of the time it was the kitchen, close to 80% of the time it was the kitchen, but the other common places were family room, the office, and a couple in the bedroom. Family meals varied from functional to very dysfunctional, so on our scales we had quite a range and variability, which was important for us to be able to look at different things. There was a lot of different constellations of who attended the meal, so usually the primary parent, 85% of them were mothers, 30% had more than one parent, 40% had 3 or more siblings, so a lot of families had children, more than one child. And then we found that the average family meal was only about 20 minutes long, and that 50% had TVs on either in the adjoining room or in the room they were actually eating in, and only about a quarter had electronic devices at the meals. We actually expected to see more, but obviously TV counts as screen time as well, so I guess actually there was media there, it's just we expected to see a lot more of these other things. All right, so then of course, as you know, we stratified our sample intentionally. So we did see differences by weight status. So when we compared our overweight and obese to non-overweight, we did see some shorter overall meal times. In homes where there was obese or overweight children, they had about 10 to 15 was more common. There was also more distractions. So getting up from the meal to get things, or to go answer the phone, or to do these other things, there was more, in general, distractions. There were also tended to be fewer adults at the meal, and more TV on at the meal. And then the other one was that there was more siblings present at the meal in general in households with overweight kiddos. So one of the things I wanted to take a second here to pause and I guess go into a little more detail about, I told you earlier about seeing natural behavior, feeling like you're actually observing natural behavior. So people will still ask, like, so do you think you really got what people were really doing and things like that? Well, we, just knowing from coding some of these that some of the behaviors that kids who are between the ages 6 to 12 do, as much as you want to be on your best behavior, kids just don't live up to that standard. And even if the parent's trying to oh, we got to do this or that, kids will just do what kids do. So there's just several occurrences where I can remember a 6-year-old just grabbing it was sandbone rice is kind of strange, a stick of butter and just starting to eat it. So it's that's normal behavior, right? Because it's something a parent would definitely want to put the kibosh on, or things where they, sometimes little fights would occur, or yelling from a parent would occur. Often enough, again, that would lead you to believe that you definitely know that these are behaviors that are real, occurring at the meal, and to not think that people were being able to put on their best behavior. And again, obviously we coded for these interpersonal interactions, and we're able to kind of compare between households. But it was after coding, we tried to looking at some of these different videos afterwards. It's over and over again. There's examples of where that behavior was very natural in the home environment, especially between siblings. I have to say, there was one in which this is just a side, but there was one in which they were having corn on the cob for dinner, and one of the kids turned to look for a minute, and the sibling grabbed the corn cob and quickly ate a couple bites and put it right back down. So just funny little things like that. Again, you know these are normal natural behaviors that people are showing us. All right, so moving forward to our analytic results here. So I mentioned earlier that when we code these different variables become continuous variables, so we're able to use them in our analyses. And so I mentioned earlier there's like family level variables, so that included things like the hostility, relationship quality, communication, and then there were specific parenting level behaviors that we'll look at. So what we found basically, the negative family level dynamics, so hostility or lecturing, we saw were associated with increased risk of childhood overweight and obesity. So the lecturing and moralizing, I told you earlier what some of those things look like. And then we also have on here the hostility, lecture, moralizing, and then we had a thing that was called silent pause. And what that is it's kind of a nonverbal where you might be talking and then you get that look, that look for someone that you just are like, be quiet, or we're done talking, or so that was called a silent pause. So it's kind of a very negative, intentional cutoff of interpersonal interaction with another person. So that's another example that those were all associated with this increased risk of overweight. And then the majority of the positive level family dynamics, so the relationship quality, the warmth, and the group enjoyment, those variables were associated with a reduced risk of childhood overweight or obesity. And so we moved to the parent level variables, and similar kind of patterns existed. So with our family level or parent level variables, this is again related to like how they interact from parent to child or around the food environment. So the negative, what we would call negative parent level dynamics, so permissiveness, and obviously permissiveness, most people know that term because it's one of those big known kind of parenting styles where there's not a lot of limit setting and kind of anything goes in a way. There was more of the permissiveness and discipline, so sometimes they set limits, sometimes they didn't. And intrusiveness, which was really the like restricting the kid or things like that. These were all associated with increased risk of child overweight and obesity as well. And then the majority of the positive parent level dynamics, so specifically the warmth and relationship quality were also associated with the reduced risk of childhood overweight and obesity. And then, of course, all these models were adjusted for age, race, and gender, and then we also adjusted for parent BMI, just for thinking about that. Of course, that might have some influence on how these families interact. So then we move to the food-related dynamics. I mentioned that we basically see similar patterns of these going on regarding the things that are considered negative versus positive family and parent level variables. And some of these, I think, are really interesting because in the literature right now, there's a lot of debate about parent practices around feeding. So if they restrict or they pressure their kid, is it associated with kid overweight or obesity? And majority of studies have found that yes, that's true, but there's some mixed findings about if it's restriction or pressuring. And is that more likely? Are you more likely to restrict your overweight or your non-overweight kid? Or are you more likely to pressure your overweight or non-overweight kid? So this kind of helps you be able to look a little bit more at specific characteristics of parenting behaviors. So really being able to look at, as we look at, not just the parental influence, which is kind of similar to the control, we could actually look at whether they were inconsistently disciplining, if they were giving positive reinforcement around certain things, if they were food intrusive, and really kind of like specific or more concrete examples of what kinds of parenting behaviors related to food were happening at this meal. All right, so some of these things, with all these studies, there's obviously limitations that go on with what we do. So one of them is that we were really intentionally trying to target a low-income minority sample. And we were able to do that, to achieve that, but at the same time we realized that that's a limitation too. We can't really generalize results across other ethnicities or races at this point, and that other races and ethnicities need to be looked at. Additionally, this is a cross-sectional study, and there's obviously temporality problems with that, and really wanting to look further at things that lead to things, what causes what, or mechanisms of change, and that we really obviously couldn't do that in this, but it's really a snapshot of what a modern day family looks like. And then the good thing about that, though, is we did receive ancillary study funding to follow families for a year. So we're now going back and getting heights and weights on these families, so we've got to see carrying forward what weight looks like based on our meal observations at time 1. And then the other thing is that we only coded for the quality of the emotional atmosphere in this study. However, again, looking at food quality of the meal, so actually what was served is important and key. And so with that study, that was the ancillary study that was funded, we also are able to take our time to code and look for actual food that's served at the meal. So, creating coding systems that are able to say whether the meal that was presented was kind of low quality or high quality food. And obviously there's challenges with that, but it's allowing us to get a first glimpse at that, since there's really been very, very little literature that has looked at some of the actual food that's served at meals and whether that's associated with actual kids' dietary intake. And then also the big question that most people want to know is, is this what matters, the food that's served, or is it more about the emotional interaction around the table that matters? Is it the quality of your interaction or the quality of the food, right? So it'll allow us to look at some of that. All right, so I mentioned a little bit about this. So we're moving forward, we really want to have a chance to look at the meal quality. So being able to look at both sides of this, the emotional atmosphere as well as the food atmosphere. And answering some of those questions that we don't know so much about yet. Siblings is another one that I have a huge interest in, really looking at how does parenting with more than one child in the family influence parents' feeding practices. So again, really few studies have done this, but there's a lot of interest in, so do parents have one kid who's picky but another kid who's not? Do they treat one kid differently and feed them differently? Yet as you think back to the story, when I made you reflect on your family story, did you think of that there was one sibling in the family that was picky, or were you the kid that they called picky? And how did the family accommodate that? Did they let you eat another meal? Did they force you to eat the meal in front of you? Did they make 4 meals? How do parents accommodate for that? And does that cause more stress in the family, so family meals happen less often, right? So all these things that would be helpful to know around the meal has a lot to do with other people at the meal. So really expanding this to look at siblings, influences, and how parents respond with multiple children. And then one of the things I also wanted to talk a little bit more about was the implications of some of the stuff that we're doing. So the family-based intervention research, I think is clearly important because we have a lot of information about in the past how a lot of interventions have not necessarily worked so well with kids around decreasing childhood obesity prevalence. And we're getting better at it, and you've probably seen recent studies that have shown that some school-based studies. There was a big meta-analysis done in the Obesity Journal a couple months ago that showed that school-based obesity prevention is getting better. There's been some analyses and reviews lately about family-based interventions are getting a little bit better. And the key thing across them has been the increased involvement of the family. So that, that's a key component, like going forward, especially around family meals. Clearly that's a key piece. You can't, when we talk about family meals, we want families at them. We have to have families at the meals. But identifying that those are key processes in reducing childhood obesity. So focusing on family meals, for instance, might be one of those key things that are useful above and beyond like these individual variables where we're saying, well, this kid just needs to eat more fruits and vegetables, or they need to exercise more. Sure, that's probably true, but there's these other like family level processes and factors that can help in this, and that the current success of the interventions that we've seen across the school-based studies and other things like that the reason those have been shown to do better is these family-based components, so including more family members, specifically parents, in these interventions. Another thing is I also am located in a primary care clinic, and we get a lot of questions about, so what do you tell parents? We want to know how to help parents in this effort with reducing childhood obesity. And so I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I went, let's see, my son turned 5 in January. So in January I went to the doctor for his well-child visit, and I went in, and the standard questions they asked, and there was one that really piqued my interest. They actually asked me if I had family meals. And I was like, yay, the literature is spreading, people are getting this message. But they actually asked me if we had family meals and how often we had them. So we know that the message is getting out there, but slowly and surely. And in the clinic I work at, we train residents, we train primary care docs who are going out into the world to do primary care, and we work with kids in their primary care visits, well-child visits with their parents. and really want to give them specific recommendations. And so things like this, where they feel like they can tell parents things to do, are a lot more useful than like change your parenting style. And that's such a huge global, huge thing to take on. And we don't even really know how to tell people to do that. Like, sure, there's parenting classes, and at the same time, especially with African American communities, there's a lot of stigma around parenting classes. And so you can't just say, go to a parenting class for all those reasons. And so there's ways in which we can like distill this down to really specific recommendations for primary care docs. The better this will be and more useful and helpful. So one of the things that we do in our clinic, besides asking the question about family meals, is we do talk with parents a little bit about actually pulling them off. What are the barriers? What are the things that happen? And we use motivational interviewing, which is a well-known technique for behavior change. And we're starting to really help them focus on the family meal. And again, I'm not saying it's the only thing that's going to matter, but it's one in which we have enough literature to be able to say that it's a place that we can really give some solid recommendations to some of our pediatricians and our primary care docs. And with regards to this specific study, some of the things, again, we have to replicate this over time and longitudinal analyses as well as other studies to be able to show this, but we're getting some sense that interpersonal relationships at the meal matter, and that in homes where kids have less overweight, we're seeing associations with these more positive interpersonal interactions. And so what, again, recommendations might show is that how do you help parents be able to specifically set limits or things at the meal, which is a lot more concrete than you need to do more limit setting. So in general, if a parent gets told that you need to do more limit setting in your home, it's really a huge construct, and it's not exactly obvious how to do that. And so if it can be very specific around like family meals, and we can create interventions that show them, whether it's through video clips of this is how you do this behavior, those type of concrete examples I think will be more helpful to parents. All right, so perfect timing. I wanted to spend a little bit of time here being able to do some question and answers, and then also, since I know there's several other people out here that do this type of research, and specifically around family meals, I think it's always useful to share ideas and be able to think about ways we move the field forward. So I know we have a few minutes now that we can switch gears to go into that mode. So we can start. There's certain questions you want to ask first. Yes?
Do you know if psychological damage can cause people to overeat, or in some cases become anorexic because the parent sort of makes fun of the person being overweight or underweight, and that has a variable there?
Yeah, so questions about if family meals, basically I'm summarizing, tell me if I'm right, that things that happen at the family meal not always be good, and that parents can say things and do things that actually can trigger disordered eating, right? So actually, that question has been well looked at with some of the data I mentioned earlier, Project EAT. There's definitely things that parents say, when they talk about a person's weight specifically. We know that is associated with more disordered eating outcomes. So yes, in fact, we do know that. And so I think that's key. That would be key recommendations that would be given to parents. How do you actually talk to your kid about this? What are safe things to talk about with your kid, whether it's at the family meal or otherwise? So yes.
What were the incentives for the study?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So what we decided to do in order to, because as you can imagine, if you're thinking about taking iPads into homes and worrying a little bit about the equipment and that it's like a hot item that anyone would want. So when I submitted this grant, I really thought through like what would be an incentive that would make someone want to do this, because it's a pretty intense study, and how do we carefully incentivize so we don't be too coercive and protect the equipment. So the answer came up with that the families would actually get the iPads that they use to record their family meals. So that way equipment was more likely to not get damaged, disappear, and it was equal to basically the amount of money that I would have paid them because of the intensity of this study. As I mentioned, they're videotaping every night, they're doing an interview, they did a home food inventory. They also, I didn't actually mention this, but they also did 3-day dietary recalls on their kids. So again, a lot of intensity of things to be done by those families. And then just quickly on data collection, pretty much most families completed all things. There was a handful, probably about 5, where we had to go with 5 of their meals versus 8 of their meals, or 4 of their meals versus 8 of their meals. We still were able to get the 3. We had a minimum that we calculated with power. We had to have at least 3 meals done to make it work. And so we were pleasantly surprised that all that data completion happened. We didn't actually lose any iPads, nothing got broken, nothing like that. So it was, and we expected some of that to happen and none of it did. Yes?
Just a question about if you had just one child in each family that was kind of your participant, and then how, if you noticed or looked at if a family had an overweight child and a normal weight child, if you looked at differential comments parents would make to the different kids, or how you kind of looked at all that if you just had one child study participant.
So, as I mentioned, we did get this second study as an ancillary study to look at the siblings in this study. So, but what I'll say is at the meals, we didn't hear a lot of weight-based comments during the meal. So we didn't hear things like telling the kid who's overweight, like, you should stop eating that, versus the non-overweight kid not telling them anything or saying, do you want more of this? We didn't actually hear a lot of like weight-based comments at the meals. So, but again, we did ask on surveys how they talk to their kids in general. So it could be that maybe the family meal isn't the place or the channel in which a lot of those types of conversations happen, although to me it makes sense they might. But on surveys, and so we haven't looked at this yet, but they did answer things about how they talk to their kid about their weight or their shape or their size, or how they did physical about healthy eating or physical activity or things like that. So it's yet to be seen if they say something there. But we did see in general differences in how emotionally they responded to them. So we haven't actually done any of those analyses yet, but we do have coded data that would show like a parent was more hostile to the sibling than to the other kid. And we haven't looked to see if that has any bearing on, if the kid was overweight or not, the weight status. But that would be, definitely an interesting thing to still look at, and we're planning on it, we just haven't got to that yet.